Antonio, an 80-year-old man, has always been known for his strength, determination, and ability to face any obstacle that comes his way. Brought up in difficult times, he had known what it was like to work hard from a young age. That's why, when he became Eduardo's father, albeit an adoptive one, he devoted himself entirely to him, offering him a better life full of opportunities. Antonio didn't have much to give, but his love and willingness to ensure that Eduardo was well educated and grew up in a safe and loving environment were more than enough for him. As unforgiving and demanding as the outside world was, Antonio always believed that as long as he had Eduardo by his side, nothing could really break him. But over time, things began to change. Eduardo grew up, and little by little, the bonds that had seemed indestructible began to loosen. Adolescence brought a natural distancing, but Antonio understood. It was a time of transition, and he knew that his son needed to find his own way. When Eduardo went to college, their relationship became a little more distant, but Antonio never stopped being there for him. He supported him in everything he could, even financially when necessary. The pride of seeing him graduate, of seeing him pursue his career, was the greatest reward for a father like Antonio. It was as if all his pains and difficulties throughout his life had been worth it, because he knew he had raised a man capable of conquering the world. However, over the years, an emptiness began to settle in Antonio's heart. Eduardo was no longer the little boy who ran around the garden with a twinkle in his eye, asking his father to accompany him every step of the way. He had become a busy man, and time no longer seemed to be his friend. Visits, which had once been frequent, began to become sporadic. Phone calls became rare. When Eduardo came, the conversations were no longer about his old dreams, but about work, commitments, and issues that seemed increasingly distant from Antonio's reality. He felt like he was becoming a stranger in his own son's life. It wasn't until his health began to fail that the reality really became apparent. Antonio, who had always remained active, now found himself struggling to carry out simple, everyday tasks. Getting out of bed in the morning was a challenge. His joints, which had previously helped him walk with ease, began to ache with every movement. He knew the years were taking their toll, but what really scared him wasn't the physical decline, it was the emotional decline. With age, loneliness seemed to become his constant companion. He couldn't understand how he had got there, how his son, the boy to whom he had given everything, now seemed to be drifting further and further away. What began as a small feeling of discomfort soon turned into growing anguish. As he sat alone in the living room, looking out of the window, Antonio felt a tightness in his heart as he thought about the future. He knew he was no longer the man he used to be, but he couldn't imagine that his own son would see him like this. He thought of what awaited him, an asylum, a place where he would be treated as just another number, where conversations would be short and faces unfamiliar. He never imagined that, after a lifetime of dedication, his fate would end this way, without the comfort of a son by his side, without the affection and company of someone he thought would be there forever. All of this got worse with every visit from Eduardo. His son would come with a distant look on his face, an expression of someone who was just fulfilling an obligation. Conversations, when they happened, were quick and impersonal. Antonio began to feel like he was being treated like a burden, something that could be discarded when he was no longer needed. The idea of an asylum began to take shape in Antonio's mind, but he refused to accept it. He remembered what he had done for Eduardo, everything he had sacrificed over the years. He knew that he still had something to offer, that he could still be useful, that he could still have value. And yet, everything seemed to indicate that he was about to be left behind irreversibly. And then, on one of these visits, what seemed like a simple comment turned into confirmation of his greatest fear. Eduardo, with a tired look on his face, started talking about the need to find a place for Antonio, a retirement home where he could be looked after while Eduardo concentrated on his life and work. His son spoke about the nursing home with a certain indifference, as if it were a decision already made, something that didn't merit further discussion. He mentioned the benefits, the doctors, and the structure of the place, but what Antonio heard were no words of affection or understanding. He heard a farewell disguised as care. He knew what that meant. It was the end of a cycle. It was the end of his place in Eduardo's life. The knot in his throat tightened, and the pain spread through Antonio's body like a wave. He looked at his son, trying to find something in his eyes, something that would make him believe that it was all just a misunderstanding. But he couldn't. What stood before him was not the son he knew, but someone distant, someone who seemed to see his life as a burden to be discarded. It was as if the world had stopped for a moment. Antonio knew that from that moment on, his life would take a turn he had never imagined. That night, alone in his room, reality hit him hard. He felt the pain of loss, not of a loved one, but the loss of his own dignity. Over the next few days, Antonio was immersed in a mixture of feelings that he had never experienced before. The initial shock slowly turned into something deeper, something he couldn't ignore. He found himself reliving the moments of the past, the times when he had felt proud to be able to give Eduardo everything he needed. He recalled the sacrifices he had made, which had never been questioned, the hours of exhausting work, the sleepless nights, the mistakes he had made because he was so dedicated, but which he believed were necessary to ensure a better future for his son. And now it seemed that all this was worthless. What he realized, with painful clarity, was that Eduardo no longer saw him in the same way. There was no more room for the old father who had given everything for him. Antonio didn't know how to deal with it. At that moment, he made a decision that would change his life forever. He wouldn't go to the nursing home. Not like that, not with that feeling of abandonment hanging over him. He wouldn't be discarded just like that, without trying to fight for what was rightfully his. Instead of surrendering to loneliness, to oblivion, Antonio decided that he would not let his life be defined by his son's indifference. He was no longer willing to accept being treated like a burden, something to be tucked away in a corner until time consumed him. Antonio knew he still had a lot to offer. He knew he could still be relevant, important, and above all loved. That's when he began to remember something very simple but powerful. He still had his voice. Even though his body was no longer the same, his mind was still sharp, and his heart, although wounded, was far from broken. He decided that he would not allow the pain to consume him. Instead, he began to look for ways to rekindle the flame that had always motivated him. Antonio began to rededicate himself to what made him feel alive, to what made him feel useful. He began to remember the small things he had always done from the heart, without asking for anything in return. He started helping his neighbors with small jobs, tending to the gardens of people who were too busy with their own lives. He realized that time, although scarce, could still be used for something good. Antonio made friends with other elderly people in the community who, like him, felt the weight of loneliness. He found comfort in these small interactions, but he also discovered something new. He felt that he no longer needed to depend on Eduardo to be happy, to have a purpose. Antonio's life was not limited to what he had experienced alongside his son. He had a support network that, although small, was powerful. He discovered that he could still contribute to the world, could still make a difference in the lives of others, and most importantly, that the pain he felt didn't have to define his worth. But the internal struggle was still there. With every sincere smile from a neighbor, from a newly won friend, Antonio felt grateful. However, there was still a piece of his soul that couldn't find peace. Eduardo's presence, or rather Eduardo's absence, was always there, like a shadow. How could someone who had raised him with so much love, with so much effort, now be so distant? Antonio thought of the times when his son was still a child, the tight hugs, the shared laughter, the plans made for the future. It all seemed so far away, so unattainable. He needed to understand what had happened, what he had lost. Even with the company of his new friends, with the friendly chats on the park bench, he felt that something was missing. Something he could never get back. It was then, on one of those days of silent reflection, that he decided to take action. No longer would he be the old man who expected to be looked after. No longer would he be the father who expected understanding. He no longer wanted to be at the mercy of what others decided for him. Antonio decided that he would be the one to make the choice. He looked for every way to feel worthy again, not just in Eduardo's eyes, but in his own. He sought professional help to deal with his emotional wounds and started exercising to keep his mind and body more active. He understood that, as long as he was still breathing, he had something to offer. Old Antonio, the man who had faced so much adversity in his life, was now beginning to understand that the biggest challenge would be to face up to his own vulnerability. But in doing so, a part of him knew that the battle wasn't just in his mind. It was a fight against society's expectations, against the idea that, as people got older, they should be discarded, as if time made them useless. And most of all, it was a struggle against the pain of being forgotten by those he loved the most. Antonio knew that, however much he tried to reinvent himself, however much he dedicated himself to others and to himself, there was something deeper he needed to understand. Could his son still see him? Or was he already irretrievably lost to the son he had raised? It was on a cold autumn morning that Antonio received confirmation of what he had been dreading: Eduardo's last phone call. The phone rang, and the sound seemed to echo through the empty house. Antonio looked at the handset hesitantly, his heart beating fast. For days, he had been waiting for this moment, unsure of what to say, unsure of what to expect. After a long time without contact, now would be the opportunity to clarify everything. He took a deep breath and answered, his voice firm but his eyes watering. What he didn't know was that this simple gesture would change the course of his life. "Hi, Eduardo's voice came from the other side, cold and distant, as if the time and distance between them had created an abyss that was impossible to bridge. Antonio felt a lump in his throat, but kept quiet. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he also knew he couldn't wait any longer. In the silence, he saw his whole life flash before his eyes. He had dedicated himself so much, given everything he could, and now the only thing left was this tenuous thread of connection with the son who, for him, still represented the future. Eduardo continued, without realizing the pain he was causing with his words. "I know you're upset with me. I'm just busy, Dad. You understand, don't you?" Antonio's voice faltered for a moment, but he pulled himself together. What would he say? How could he express years of love, sacrifices, sleepless nights, and unconditional dedication? How could he make himself understood in the face of such indifference? "I understand, Eduardo," Antonio replied, his voice calm but his heart racing. "I understand more than you know." And at that moment, the weight of each word was stronger than any anger or sadness he might have felt. He didn't want to fight anymore. He no longer wanted to force anything. He simply wanted to be heard. He wanted his son to see him as a human being, with flaws and weaknesses, but also with the right to be loved. Eduardo, on the other hand, didn't seem to realize the depth of what was happening. "You know, Dad, my life is very hectic. I think it's time for you to consider other options like the nursing home. You know, I really can't take care of everything anymore." The words fell like heavy stones on Antonio, and he felt each one resonating in his soul. It wasn't the first time he'd heard something like that, but at that moment, something inside him broke. He closed his eyes and for the first time, felt completely alone. It was the final word he didn't want to hear, the decision he dreaded, but at the same time, the only possibility he hadn't really considered. The son he loved no longer cared about his presence, no longer wanted to carry the weight of an elderly father's responsibility. Antonio felt the emptiness spreading inside him. He had given everything to that boy. Everything. But now it seemed that he was no longer needed. Nothing made sense anymore. The pain of being discarded by the person he loved most was indescribable. That moment was like a sharp blade cutting him in half. But what happened next surprised even Antonio. Instead of letting himself be consumed by the pain, as usual, he felt something awaken inside him, a silent flame of resistance. He knew he could no longer depend on Eduardo, but not because he didn't want to. It was because he knew that if there were any remnants of love and respect left, he couldn't go on being treated like this. Antonio, with painful clarity, realized that his son's love could not be forced. It was something that had to come from a heart, something that couldn't be conditioned to situations and sacrifices. He needed something more. He needed peace. Eduardo, he said, with a calm he didn't know he possessed. I understand. I'm going to go my own way, but in a way you never expected. I will no longer be bound by your decision. I'm more than that, and I'm going to show myself to the world, to myself, and if you ever come back, I'll be here, but no longer as you expect. I'm your father, but I'm also Antonio, and that's a man who deserves to live fully. Those words were like a cry for release, not out of revenge or anger, but out of Antonio's need to recover his own dignity, to free himself from the burden he had carried for so long. In that instant, he made a decision. He would no longer be held hostage to Eduardo's approval. He would no longer be a prisoner of conditional love. He was ready to rediscover himself, to rebuild his life, regardless of his son's decision. When the call ended, Antonio felt the silence in the house differently. Instead of being a silence of loneliness, it was now a silence of freedom. He knew that this would not be the end of his story, but perhaps the beginning of a new chapter. Time passed, and what Antonio experienced after that conversation was no longer a struggle against rejection, but a journey of self-discovery. He didn't give in to sadness or let himself be consumed by bitterness. On the contrary, he chose to rebuild himself, to understand his own strength and value. Over the next few days, he distanced himself from everything that made him feel small, and without the pressure of Edward's judgment, he found a new reason to live. He began to write letters to himself, talking about everything he hadn't said, about all the love he held inside him. He got involved in activities that made him feel alive again. Walks around the city, conversations with old friends, and even short trips to places he had always dreamed of visiting. He realized that a man's worth is not measured by others, but by the way he sees himself and allows himself to live with dignity, regardless of the circumstances. One spring afternoon, a year after that conversation, Antonio was sitting in his favorite chair in the garden, feeling the gentle warmth of the sun and listening to the birdsong. He thought of Eduardo, but now without pain. He knew that his son had made his choices, and that those choices could no longer determine his happiness. Antonio had no regrets. He was at peace. Then the phone rang again. This time, the voice on the other end didn't have the distant tone of before. It was Eduardo, with a request that, even without words, overflowed with regret. "Dad," he said, his voice shaking, I'm sorry for everything. I was such an idiot. I was so lost, and now I see. I want to see you." Antonio didn't have to reply immediately. He just smiled to himself, knowing that the real gift he had given himself was not reconciliation, but the freedom to live on his own. And perhaps, on this new path, Eduardo would also find his way back to him. The cycle was closing, but in a different way, without expectations, without fear, and with the hope that one day, the love between them will blossom again, but now in a stronger and more genuine way. Just for those of you who like a good story and have watched to the end, leave your comment below from which city you're watching, and I'll leave a heart in your comment. Bye, and see you in the next video.